is the difference between a wine sommelier and a beer sommelier or a Cicerone, apart from the type of alcoholic beverage?
The title sommelier is not trademarked like Cicerone. No one can call themselves that legally without having completed certification.
Who started the Cicerone organization?
Ray Daniels, a beer professional, got sick of going out to bars and being served a beer and the dirty glass. The beer itself might have been sitting in the keg for too long. It was tired. If you get a bottle of wine, it can withstand a little bit of abuse. But beer, once it's brewed, it starts degrading like immediately. People have this idea that a can of beer is like a can of food, that you put it on the shelf and it doesn't change, but that's really not correct. So Ray was like, we need structured education for professionals.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 175. What's the difference between a wine sommelier and a beer sommelier, or Cicerone? Which glass is best for properly appreciating great beer? And what can you expect from Arizona as an up-and-coming wine region? You'll hear those stories and more during my chat with James Atkinson, host of the Drinks Adventures podcast. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show with the continuing story of publishing my new wine memoir. They say don't judge a book by its cover, but we all do. Just as many of us buy wines based on the label. The cover can make or break a book, as it's the first impression readers have when browsing in stores or online. That's why I'm terrified that shortly after signing with my publisher, they're already talking about designing the cover. I thought I had months to mull that over, but no. The sales and marketing teams need the cover early in the process to help sell to their customers, book retailers. My opinions will be considered, but ultimately it'll be the sales and marketing teams who determine the final design. I may have written the book, but I'm neither a designer nor a book sales rep. A strong cover captures the book's story without giving too much away and conveys or hints at the emotional journey the reader will take. It also stands out in its genre while still looking like part of it. In my case, that would be memoirs and biographies. And it's not just about the main illustration or photograph. It's also about the text, fonts, white space, and other elements that together create the message. Some of my favorite book covers are among the simplest. Wild by Cheryl Strayed with just one hiking boot. And Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert with the title words spelled out using pasta, prayer beads, and petals. What's your favorite book cover? Would you like to give me feedback on my new memoir cover as we develop it for Wine Witch on Fire? Let me know. In the meantime, I'll share a beta reader review of the memoir with you. This one is from Wayne and Goderich. Quote, reading this book is like having a profoundly deep and revealing talk with a wise and joyful woman friend who shares with you how she felt in many situations that you, if you are a man, may have assumed were quite benign. It can be part of a reevaluation of your own approach and attitude in relationships. Hopefully, this is a confirmation that the current you has progressed to being a fairly good person. Very lean and hard-hitting writing, but this is not a polemic against men. The themes are much larger than a specific industry, so it should appeal to a pretty wide audience. What I'd say to friends is, you have to read this book. It reached me in so many ways. I know you'll enjoy it. To the rest, I describe it as very well written on a topic that's very current, very ingrained in our culture and undergoing a profound change. It's well researched, and you learn a lot while you're entertained. Many of us will find elements of ourselves in the book, either as the victim or the perpetrator, and probably elements of both. It doesn't candy coat the faults of the victim nor excuse the vicious nature of the enemy. The story moves along at a breakneck speed through a roller coaster of emotional ups and downs. I won't reveal the final result, but you'll be more informed and probably a better person when you have absorbed this book. A great read and a perfect book for book clubs, as strong opinions will emerge. It deserves to be widely read by a wide audience. End quote. Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate that. I've posted a link to the blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/175. This is where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know that you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at the manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll also find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with James, links to his website and podcast, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you'll find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/175. Okay, on with the show. James Atkinson is the creator of the Drinks Adventures podcast, winner of the Best Podcast at the Australian Wine Communicator Awards of 2021. He's a lover of all fine drinks. James was previously the editor of the Australian Brew News and the drinks industry publication The Shout, a certified Cicerone, beer sommelier, and two-time winner of the Australian International Beer Awards Prize for Best Media. James has judged at several very prestigious beer competitions. As a journalist, he has contributed to publications including The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, Halliday, Gourmet Traveler Wine, Good Food, Selector, and more. Welcome, James. It's so great to have you here with us.
Thanks so much for having me on, Natalie.
My pleasure. All right. Now we're going to get into your wine career, but I want to start with a few of your favorite stories. So you mentioned that you once welcomed Jancis Robinson, editor of the Oxford Companion of Wine, kind of wine royalty. She's also the columnist for the Financial Times of London. You welcomed her to your house. What happened? What was going on?
Well, that was a bit of a pinch me moment, really, because, I started the Drinks Adventures podcast in 2018, and I think it was 2019, so I'd probably been maybe a year into running the podcast. And to be fair, it was early days for the show. I didn't have a huge track record that would sort of warrant me getting a guest like Jancis Robinson on. But when the new edition of the World Atlas of Wine was published, Jancis was in Australia, and I did get sort of a generic email from a PR person sort of mentioning that Jancis was available for interviews. And I said that I'd be dead keen to have Jancis on the podcast. And soon after, I just got noticed that, yes, Jancis could do it. Where did I want to do it? And I said, well, I normally record at home. And then Jancis, ended up coming round to my place in Sydney to record an episode of the show, which was a bit of a pinch me moment. I've got huge respect for Jancis, and even more so now because it was a great interview, of the favourite sort of episodes of mine that we've done. But also it kind of probably gave the podcast a bit of extra credibility. And it kind of means that when people see that you've had that caliber of guest on, it just makes it that much easier to get other guests on. And so I've kind of probably been pretty lucky that things have snowballed since then.
So what was she like? I know she's very articulate, of course, very knowledgeable about wine, but what other impressions did you have? Like, okay, forgive the perhaps typically female question, but what was she wearing? Because she's got such a great style sense, too.
You're expecting me to remember that as a man.
That's true. Never mind. She had clothes on.
Yeah. Look, if you go to my Instagram, there's a selfie back there from a couple of years ago that I took with her. So we have to dig back to find it. Yeah.
Did you have any other impressions of her before or after the interview? I mean, anything about her as a person?
Yeah, I just think she's quite a very humble person. I mean, we're talking about who is probably the most influential wine writer or wine critic that's still working today. Certainly one of two or three in the world. I don't think many people would dispute that. She just doesn't really have any of the pretension that some people in the world of wine might do. I just found her to be really lovely to talk to, and very sort of just a very relaxed conversationalist. So it was good.
Wow, that's great. Did anything she said during the interview surprise you? Anything she said about wine or anything else? Or do you remember a tidbit of what she shared with you that was kind of the highlight of the conversation itself?
There's many different things that we talked about in that interview around sort of the level of work that goes into creating a new edition of the Atlas of Wine. Now, I know you've got a few books out, Natalie, but
Nothing on that scale.
I had to do a 20,000 word project for someone recently, and that was enough to get me kind of going, wow, like, I don't know if I've got a long form book in me, really. And so I think probably just the level of dedication and the level of hard work that Jancis has put in over her career to get where she has and to create the canon of wine literature that she has.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you interviewed one of your teen idols, Maynard James Keenan. Tell us about who he is first, if we don't know, and why you were talking to him about wine.
Yeah, well, it's probably a name that some of your listeners will kind of be familiar with him, but he's the frontman of Tool, a hard rock band from America, and also another rock band called A Perfect Circle, and he's also got his own act called Pucifer. But more recently, he's become known as a winemaker. He's got a winery in Arizona. He's kind of helped pioneer the Arizona wine region.
Does he actually make the wine, or does he just sort of own the winery? He makes it.
He actually is the winemaker.
So he is a winemaker rock star.
Absolutely.
I use that phrase all the time, but he truly is.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of sort of fairly cynical, shall we say, celebrity wine projects out there these days. And my thing with the podcast has been, if I'm going to have a celebrity on that's got their own wine brand, they need to have a little bit more skin in the game and be a little bit more involved in the production than just putting their name to it, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
And Maynard certainly passes that test. And I've just been a Tool fan since, my teens, and probably seen Tool over a dozen times, I would say, at different stages of my life. And so to be able to interview him on the show was amazing. And really happy with the interview.
Did you just reach out to him directly, or how did you land the interview?
I sort of had to find out who his handlers were and then be very patient. It took a long time. Busy guy, obviously. And he doesn't do a lot of interviews. That's the other thing. So I could tell he was kind of on guard at the beginning of the interview and wondering if I was just a Tool fan wanting to talk to him rather than taking him seriously as a winemaker. And so it took all my self-control not to sort of just ask him self-interested questions. And we really just spoke about the wine pretty much for the whole interview.
Oh, wow. And again, anything memorable in particular that he said or about him during that conversation?
Well, he's been heavily influenced by Australian wine, and I probably hadn't realised how much that was the case. He's got kind of a few friends down here, and he's gotten to know Peter Gago, the Penfolds chief winemaker, quite well. And when he was establishing his winery, he kind of had be emailing Peter Gago and asking him all these winemaking questions, and they're just such an unusual pairing of people to imagine.
Because Peter is so reserved, and I mean, he's just so well-spoken.
So English and
yes, he
well-spoken,
is, isn't he?
And, know, and then you've got Maynard, who's a rock star's rock star. So it's just kind of a cool, quirky sort of backstory that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah. And what did you say his winery's name is?
Caduceus Cellars.
Oh, Caduceus.
Merkin Vineyards are the two labels.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I have not heard much about Arizona wines. Presumably they do red grapes that need a lot of sun to ripen. Is that kind of what he was specializing in?
Mediterranean varieties, I think.
Like Mourvedre or Syrah or things like that?
I think they've kind of more moved to Nebbiolo and varieties like that, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, but actually they've got a whole fruit salad of different varieties there. I think being a new region, people are still at the point of like trying things out and seeing what works and still refining what they do. So it's early days for the region, and I've not had a chance to try the wines, but from what I've heard, they've improved a lot in the last decade or so that he's been there.
Huh. So Can you remember the exact moment when you decided you wanted to write about wine, spirits, beer?
Well, that was just sort of like a lot of careers. It's just kind of happened organically, I guess. I mean, it started with me being a journalist. I studied broadcast journalism, actually, and that was between 97 and 99. And it wasn't like I had a real sort of yearning to be a journalist, but it was just, I've kind of always been interested in the news, and I knew that maths and sciences was not my bag. And so I studied journalism, and I'd kind of worked as a journalist in all sorts of different verticals. As you can tell, I'm into my music. I did a lot of freelance music writing early on in my career. I've done a lot of different business sort of trade publications, whether it's about property or business support services, like some pretty dry, boring stuff, to be fair. But I also was, I was interested in wine. I was interested in good beer. I liked food. And then when a job came up it was 2011, I think, to edit a publication called theshout.com.au, which is read by the liquor trade over here. So, buyers from retailers and bar operators, that type of thing. And when I got that job, it was a news writing job for them. I just fell in love with the industry and kind of really just haven't left. And it's just sort of been an evolution of different things that I've done since I worked at the Shout.
Sure, sure. And over your career, can you take us to the worst moment of your writing career, if any in particular stand out?
I don't know if there's a particular moment, but there would definitely, I kind of just think back to some of the uninspiring sort of writing jobs that I've had about very dry subject area. And it does make a big difference when you're writing about something that you're passionate about, and also something that you're writing about where the people you're talking to are passionate about it. Like when you're doing some business journalism, it's transactional in every sense. The interviews, it's just sort of about money and making money and managing risk and all these types of things. And the people are not passionate about what they're talking about. Whereas obviously, as you know, when you're speaking to producers of wine or whatever it might be, these people love what they do and they love talking about it. And that can be quite inspiring and makes it much more enjoyable.
Indeed, yeah, because I know on both sides of the fence, both those of us who write about wine and those who make wine, we're definitely not in it for the money.
Yeah, this is true.
Yes, wine writers or beer writers, I'm sure, can make a full-time living of it. Like usually you have some other either day job or trust fund, or you married up, shall we say. And the old adage, how to make $1 million in the wine business, like opening a winery, is to start with 10 million. So, I mean, it's not about the money, it's about the passion. So I can imagine that would draw you in as a writer, that animated sort of heat of excitement about what you do and what you're writing about. In retrospect, would you have done anything differently in your path to get to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing was I studied broadcast journalism, and the first sort of decade or so of my career, I actually kind of ended up doing mainly online and print. And I always kind of wanted to work in radio. And if I did do anything differently, it probably would have been to take my career a little bit more seriously earlier on and try and get into radio and try and sort of make a career specifically in radio broadcast journalism. It would probably have been at the ABC, which is like our NPR or something along those lines.
CBC in Canada, yep, I know what you're talking about, yeah.
Serious radio journalism, I would have liked to have done. I think I would have enjoyed that. I think I would have thrived doing that. And I still kind of have a bit of an interest in doing it, but I think the older you get, the harder it is to kind of take a job in government radio and go back to the start again, you know what I mean?
Sure.
The podcast, in a way, has sort of evolved from a bit of a frustration of mine that I didn't do that. And so...
Yeah, well, you're doing it now. You're doing the new radio with podcasting.
That's right. That's right. In a very niche topic area, but, you've got to kind of work with the niches that you have, so...
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's all about the long tail these days. The niches, they say the riches are in the niches or the riches, but I don't know about riches, but at least the passionate audience is there.
Yeah, that's
when
right.
you specialize. Yeah. So let's talk about what is the difference between a wine sommelier and a beer sommelier, or a Cicerone, they're called, and you are one, apart from the obvious in terms of the focus on the particular type of alcoholic beverage.
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly the fundamental difference is that anyone can call themselves a wine sommelier. So I think if I was to open a wine bar tomorrow and put out a press release telling everyone that I'd opened a wine bar, I could just say that I was a sommelier and that I would be choosing the wines. Obviously, a certified sommelier is a different thing entirely, but the title sommelier is not sort of trademarked like Cicerone is. So Cicerone is a registered trademark and no one can call themselves that legally without having completed certification.
And who is the originating body? Where did that start? Who started the Cicerone organization?
It's an American guy named Ray Daniels who's based in Chicago, and he was a brewer and a beer professional and got sick of like going out to bars and being served a beer and, you know, the beer would be served in a dirty glass. The beer itself might have been sitting in the keg for too long. It was old, it was tired. Because beer's not like wine, you know, in that wine, if you get a bottle of wine, as long as you don't kind of heat it up too much, as long as you're reasonably careful with it, it can withstand a little bit of abuse over a longer period of time.
Surprising amount, yeah.
Yeah, if you want to cellar it for 10, 15, 20 years, then that's a different story. But beer, it's sort of like once it's brewed, once it's in the package, once it's in the keg, it starts degrading like immediately. And so people sort of have this idea that a can of beer is like a can of food, that you put it on the shelf and it doesn't change, but that's really not correct. And so Ray kind of got sick of being out in bars and having terrible experiences when he'd order a beer. And he just was like, we need some kind of structured, you know, education program for professionals working in licensed venues, bars and restaurants. That's predominantly what it was targeted at.
Yeah, and what is the life of a beer? I'm just curious. You mentioned that. So it's canned or bottled. How long can you keep beer before it goes bad?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the style.
Okay.
But really, I mean, 6 months, I would say, is kind of probably a pretty good benchmark for most beer styles. The really sort of hoppy India Pale Ale beer, IPAs that kind of dominate the US craft beer market, they're really best within the first 3 months, and they kind of degrade a bit. They degrade more quickly because the hop characters, those really vibrant, fruity characters, they're very volatile and they just start to be depleted over time. But then there are beer styles that you can cellar if you look after them, and they tend to be the higher alcohol, more intense ones. And obviously alcohol is a great preservative, as we know. And so those beer styles that are upwards of 8% or maybe 10, 12% imperial stouts, you know, you can sort of comfortably age them often for 2 or 3 years or significantly longer.
Do they get better? Do they taste better with age? Oh, is that subjective?
It's subjective, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
It's sort of about whether you like the more robust, intense sort of characters or whether you like the roasty, sort of boozy, intense characters to soften off a little bit like the tannins drop out of a sort of red wine, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. What is involved in becoming a Cicerone? How many levels or courses or hours of study? How many beers tasted? That sort of thing. What does it take? Is it anything like the Master of Wine process?
Well, I'm a certified Cicerone. There's one level below that, which is certified beer server, which is kind of, you know, that's pretty easy to get. It's a multiple choice exam that you have to take, I think. But then like sommelier, there's then advanced Cicerone and then there's master Cicerone. And Master Cicerone, there's only 20 of them in the world, I believe, at the moment. And without knowing exactly what's involved with Master of Wine, apart from what I've heard anecdotally, I would say that Master Cicerone is very difficult to do. I think the pass, did you say the pass rate was 10% for Master of Wine? For
Master of Wine.
Yeah, I think it's the same for the Master Cicerone exam.
Okay.
So, yeah, certified Cicerone. You know, I studied for that quite a lot for a few months and a lot of blind tasting to be able to distinguish different beer styles and to be able to identify common faults. So it was hard work for a few months, but anyone who I think is dedicated enough would be able to do it. And it obviously depends on what your background is. If you're already a brewer, you know, and you've already studied other elements of brewing, other elements of the syllabus, then obviously it's not as much of a leap for you to become a certified Cicerone. Like for me, I'd never worked in a bar before, and I'm not a brewer. So there were sort of more the technical, scientific aspects of it that I needed to learn.
And was there a service component where you're serving beer to judges like there is in, I think that's Master Sommelier program has that part of it. Did you have to go through that?
Yeah, there's a demonstration that you have to do, and the most common thing that is taking apart a faucet, like a beer faucet, and cleaning it, or showing how you clean it. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, the whole aspect of beer service, which involves the draft service, is a very different sort of element of beer to what you see with wine, and making sure that the draft lines are clean and regularly cleaned and looked after is really important. So that's one part of it.
Oh, wow. And when you serve beer, do you recommend a wine glass or a beer glass?
I mean, the best glass is the one in your hand, I always say, but
yes.
I think, to appreciate it properly, I think in a tulip-style glass is good.
A wine glass.
Well, I mean, you can buy tulip-style beer glasses that are specifically for beer, but a wine glass will do just fine. Like a wine glass, like what you would use with, like you would drink a sort of heavier red wine in, I would say it'd be perfect. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Do you have a favorite type of beer and food pairing?
Yeah, I'd probably call out, as just the whole style, the Belgian Saison. It's a farmhouse-style beer that kind of, back in the day, it was like when the water supply wasn't very good, it was what Belgian farmers would kind of brew to satiate their workers. Their workers would just drink it during the day, and it was very low in alcohol.
So it's a light beer?
They've kind of evolved. They're a bit higher in alcohol now, and the style parameters are actually quite broad for a Saison, but it's very much a yeast-driven beer. It's about, the spicy, fruity characters of the yeast. And they're very highly carbonated, very refreshing, and extremely food-friendly. You could drink them with any manner of different foods, really. And they're really good with salads, lighter foods, seafood. So, yeah, Saison du Pont is a good example of that style, a classic example.
Oh, that sounds great.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with James. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, I enjoyed learning the difference between a wine sommelier and a beer sommelier or a Cicerone. So many similarities. It's really interesting. Number 2, even though I'm not a beer drinker, it's good to know which glass is best for appreciating good beer. That tip will be handy for my partner Miles, who loves local craft beer. And 3, Arizona is a fascinating up-and-coming wine region. I would have thought that viticulture would not be possible in such a warm area. I look forward to trying the wine someday. In the show notes, you'll find links to James' website and podcast, my free online wine pairing class, and the video versions of these conversations. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/175. Email me if you have a tip, sip, question, or would like to be a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with James. If you like this episode, please tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines and stories we discussed. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a delicious Shiraz. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.